While most people spend their lives trying to find themselves, Pessoa spent his deliberately fragmenting himself into dozens of distinct personalities, each with their own philosophies, writing styles, and complete biographies. This was not mental illness, creative playfulness, or mere literary technique. Pessoa created what he called heteronyms, a term he carefully distinguished from pseudonyms. A pseudonym is simply a mask you wear. A heteronym is someone else you become. He invented at least 72 of these alternate selves, with 3 main ones becoming fully developed literary figures. Alberto Cairo, the naive shepherd poet who wrote about direct perception without thought. Ricardo Reis, the classical Stoic physician who preached acceptance of fate. And Álvaro de Campos, the modernist engineer who swung between manic exaltation and profound emptiness. Each wrote poetry and prose that contradicted the others. Each had different birthplaces, professions, political views, and philosophies of life. Pessoa himself became simply one more voice in this orchestra of selves. His philosophy cannot be separated from this practice. The heteronyms were not tools for exploring ideas. They were the ideas themselves made flesh. Through them, Pessoa dismantled the European philosophical tradition's core assumption, that there exists a unified, coherent self at the centre of consciousness. He proposed instead that identity is fundamentally plural, consciousness inherently fragmented, and the authentic self a convenient fiction we tell ourselves. What we call the self is actually a parade of competing voices, none more real than the others. Every human being, Pessoa suggested, is already multiple. Most of us just lack the courage or clarity to acknowledge it. This raises immediate questions that pierce to the heart of human existence. If there is no unified self, who is responsible for our actions? If consciousness is fragmented, what holds experience together? If all identity is performance, is anything authentic? If the self is fiction, why do we feel so continuous? These questions drove Pessoa's entire philosophical project and remain unresolved in contemporary philosophy and psychology. Part 1. The dismantling of identity. The standard story humans tell about identity goes like this. You are born, you develop a personality, you make choices that reflect your character, and throughout all changes you remain fundamentally you. There is continuity, coherence, a thread connecting the child you were to the adult you become. Philosophers from Descartes to Kant to Husserl built elaborate systems on this foundation. Psychology assumes it, law depends on it. Our entire social world requires believing that the person who commits a crime is the same person who stands trial months later. Pessoa looked at this story and declared it false. Not metaphorically false or poetically false, but actually false. A dangerous illusion that humans cling to because the alternative terrifies them. His heteronym system was designed to reveal this truth experientially. By creating distinct personalities and inhabiting them fully, he demonstrated that what we call identity is not discovered but constructed. It is not essential but performed, not singular but multiple. Consider Alberto Cairo, whom Pessoa described as his master. Cairo was born in Lisbon in 1889, but spent most of his life in the countryside. He had minimal education and supposedly knew almost nothing of literature or philosophy. His poetry celebrates pure sensation without interpretation. When Cairo sees a flower, he sees a flower, nothing more. No metaphor, no symbol, no deeper meaning. Just the immediate experience of colour and form. His most famous work, The Keeper of Sheep, contains lines like, "To think is to not understand. The universe is not explained, it is seen." For Cairo, thinking destroys direct perception. Philosophy builds walls between consciousness and reality. The goal is to unlearn everything that separates you from immediate experience. Now consider Ricardo Reis, created as Cairo's disciple, but philosophically opposed to him in crucial ways. Reis was born in Porto in 1887, studied medicine at a Jesuit school, and eventually fled to Brazil after the Portuguese Republic was established, being a committed monarchist. He writes elaborate odes in classical Latin and Greek forms, influenced by Horace and Stoic philosophy. Where Cairo lives in the eternal present of pure sensation, Reyes obsesses over fate, mortality, and the futility of resistance. His philosophy: accept whatever happens with tranquility, enjoy fleeting pleasures moderately, and never delude yourself about controlling outcomes. Life is predetermined. Struggle is pointless. The wise person cultivates indifference to what cannot be changed. Then comes Álvaro de Campos, the most volatile of the three. Campos was born in Tavira in 1890, became a naval and mechanical engineer, studied in Glasgow, and travelled extensively. He writes in explosive free verse, influenced by Walt Whitman and Italian futurism. His early poems, like Triumphal Ode and Maritime Ode, express a manic desire to be everything, to feel everything, to absorb all sensations simultaneously. "I want to be drunk on everything," he declares, "to feel everything in every way." But his later work descends into crushing depression and existential emptiness, expressing alienation from modernity, from others, from himself. One heteronym sees too much, one too little, one everything at once, then nothing at all. These are not variations on a theme. They are fundamentally incompatible worldviews emerging from a single human being. Cairo rejects thought. Reyes embraces Stoic philosophy. Campos oscillates between extremes. One celebrates nature, another classical civilization, another industrial modernity. One writes in simple Portuguese with grammatical errors, another in sophisticated classical meters, another in chaotic modernist fragments. Each has his own birthday, biography, handwriting, and signature. The philosophical implications are devastating. If one person can contain these contradictory selves so completely that they produce distinct bodies of literary work, what does that say about identity? The traditional answer would be that Pessoa was the real self using masks to explore ideas. But Pessoa rejected this explanation. He insisted the heteronyms were not masks he wore, but selves he became. When writing as Cairo, he was Cairo. The Fernando Pessoa identity was no more real than any other. Just another construction, another performance, possibly the least authentic of all, since it tried to pretend toward unity. This connects to sensationism, the philosophical framework Pessoa developed in his 20s. Sensationism built on empiricist philosophy, particularly Condillac, but radicalized it. The core claim: everything begins and ends with sensation. Not thought, not reason, not transcendent spirit or eternal soul, but immediate sensory experience. All ideas, beliefs, identities emerge from sensation. All art must return to sensation. All philosophy that floats free of sensory experience is empty abstraction. But Pessoa pushed this further than traditional empiricism. For him, sensations could be cultivated, multiplied, refined into art. The goal was not passive reception of experience, but active creation of sensation. Each heteronym represented a different way of sensing reality. Cairo practices direct sensation without conceptual overlay. Reyes filters sensation through Stoic acceptance. Campos amplifies sensation to overwhelming intensity. The multiplication of selves meant multiplication of possible sensations, different ways of experiencing the world. This reveals why the heteronyms matter philosophically. They were not a literary game. They were an existential technology for expanding consciousness beyond the prison of singular identity. Most humans experience reality through one narrow lens. Pessoa demonstrated that consciousness could fragment productively, that multiplicity was not madness but method, that the supposed unity of self was actually a limitation to be overcome. Yet here is where critics begin raising objections. First, the practical problem. If identity is purely constructed and fundamentally multiple, how does anyone maintain coherence enough to function? Pessoa himself struggled with this. He worked as a commercial translator, lived alone, published almost nothing during his lifetime, and died at 47 from cirrhosis. His personal life was famously empty. The one serious romantic relationship he attempted with Ophelia Quiroz fell apart because, as he admitted, he could not maintain emotional continuity. Which self was in love? Which self would show up tomorrow? The multiplication of identity that worked brilliantly for literature made ordinary human intimacy nearly impossible. Second, the philosophical problem of responsibility. If there is no unified self, who is accountable for actions? The legal and moral systems require that the person who commits an act can be held responsible later. But if identity is fragmentary and constantly shifting, responsibility becomes impossible to assign. Pessoa acknowledged this implicitly in his writing, but never resolved it. His philosophy describes human experience more accurately than traditional accounts, but offers no framework for ethics or justice. Third, the problem of communication. When Pessoa writes as Cairo or Rice or Campos, who is really speaking? The reader encounters text but cannot locate a stable author behind it. This creates interpretive vertigo. Literary critics debate endlessly whether statements made by heteronyms reflect Pessoa's views or oppose them. The answer is probably both or neither. But this makes dialogue impossible. Communication requires believing that the person speaking now is recognizably the same person you might respond to later. Heteronyms destroy that assurance. Fourth, the empirical question: does consciousness actually work this way? Modern psychology and neuroscience suggest that while humans do experience shifting mental states and can hold contradictory beliefs, there is nevertheless neural continuity, memory integration, and self-narrative that maintains identity over time. Multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder, is considered pathological precisely because the normal integration fails. Pessoa might respond that the pathology is actually enforcing integration, that humans suffer from their desperate clinging to unified selfhood. But this remains speculative. Fifth, scholars debate whether Pessoa actually believed his philosophy, or whether the heteronyms were sophisticated aesthetic experimentation. Some argue he was genuinely multiple, that the heteronyms emerged spontaneously as authentic expressions of different aspects of himself. Others suggest it was highly controlled literary performance, Pessoa pulling strings behind the curtain. The evidence supports both readings. On March 8, 1914, Pessoa described having what he called his triumphal day, when Cairo suddenly appeared fully formed and he wrote 30 poems in rapid succession. This suggests involuntary psychological phenomenon. Yet he also wrote detailed theoretical texts explaining sensationism and planning heteronym relationships, suggesting deliberate construction. The deeper you examine Pessoa's philosophy of identity, the more it reveals uncomfortable truths about human existence while simultaneously falling apart in application. Yes, identity is more fluid and constructed than we typically acknowledge. Yes, humans contain multitudes and contradiction. Yes, the unified self is partly illusion sustained by narrative and memory, but we cannot actually live as pure multiplicity. We need continuity to form relationships, accept responsibility, and navigate time. Complete fragmentation means isolation and dysfunction. This tension between philosophical insight and practical impossibility runs through all of Pessoa's work. He saw more clearly than almost anyone how identity functions, but his very clarity made normal life unbearable. The heteronyms were simultaneously his greatest achievement and his existential trap. They proved his point by destroying him. Part 2. Reality, Fiction, and the Book of Disquiet. The Book of Disquiet represents Pessoa's most sustained meditation on the relationship between reality and fiction, consciousness and dream, living and imagining. Written primarily through his semi-heteronym Bernardo Soares, this massive fragmentary work sat unpublished in a trunk until decades after Pessoa's death. It consists of over 400 disconnected entries ranging from a paragraph to several pages, with no plot, no clear structure, no resolution, just pure philosophical introspection on the nature of existence. Soares is described as an assistant bookkeeper in a Lisbon fabric office, a modest man who lives in a rented room and spends his days doing mundane commercial work. His external life is almost completely empty, but his internal life explodes with philosophical reflection on every aspect of existence. The book's central insight appears early. I was someone else for a long time, since birth and consciousness, And suddenly I've woken up in the middle of a bridge, leaning over the river and knowing that I exist more solidly than the person I was up till now. This passage captures Pessoa's fundamental claim about reality and fiction. What we call real life, the supposedly solid external world of jobs and relationships and daily routine, is actually a kind of sleepwalking, a consensual hallucination we participate in without awareness. True reality only reveals itself in rare moments of intense self-consciousness, when the veils drop and we see ourselves seeing ourselves. But these moments are unbearable. To know nothing about yourself is to live, Suarez writes. To know yourself badly is to think. To know yourself in a flash, as I did in this moment, is to have a fleeting notion of the intimate monad, the soul's magic word. But that sudden light scorches everything, consumes everything. It strips us naked of even ourselves. Here Pessoa inverts the Socratic dictum, know thyself. For Socrates, self-knowledge was wisdom's foundation. For Pessoa, self-knowledge is catastrophic. The more clearly you see yourself, the more you realize there is nothing to see. No essential self, no continuous identity, just a series of fragmentary sensations and thoughts momentarily organized into the temporary fiction called I. Living requires not knowing this. Consciousness requires strategic blindness. The person who truly understands their own nature cannot function. This connects to Pessoa's theory about the relationship between literature and life. Most people assume literature is secondary to life, a representation or reflection of primary reality. You live, then you write about living. Experience comes first, art second. Pessoa reversed this hierarchy. For him, literature is more real than life. To write is to forget, Suarez declares. Literature is the most agreeable way of ignoring life. This sounds like escapism, but Pessoa meant something more radical. Life as typically lived is unconscious, automatic, unreflective. You go through motions without awareness. Literature forces consciousness. It makes experience explicit. In writing, you create the reality you fail to notice while living it. The fragmentary structure of the Book of Disquiet embodies this philosophy. Traditional narrative assumes continuity, causation, progress from beginning through middle to end. But Pessoa saw human experience as fundamentally discontinuous. Each moment is complete in itself, unconnected to what came before or follows after. Memory creates false continuity by imposing narrative coherence on disconnected experiences. The fragmented structure of disquiet resists this falsification. Each entry stands alone. No accumulation, no development, no resolution. Just moment after moment of acute consciousness examining itself. Consider this passage. I'm always astonished whenever I finish anything. Astonished and depressed. My desire for perfection should prevent me from ever finishing anything. It should prevent me even from starting. This reveals Pessoa's philosophy of action. All action requires believing that doing something matters, that outcomes have significance, that the future will vindicate present effort. But if reality is fundamentally fictive and identity fundamentally fragmented, action becomes impossible to justify. Why would one fragmentary self undertake effort for the benefit of a different fragmentary self that will exist tomorrow? The goal of perfection cannot be reached because there is no stable self to reach it. This creates what scholars call Pessoa's paralysis problem. His philosophy describes experience accurately, but makes engagement with the world impossible. Suarez lives almost entirely in his head. External events barely register. I live always in the present, he writes. I know nothing of the future and no longer have a past. The former weighs me down with 1,000 possibilities, the latter with the reality of nothingness. Without past or future, without believing in continuity or consequences, what remains is pure, present-tense consciousness, observing itself. Fascinating philosophically, devastating practically. The Book of Disquiet also develops what could be called Pessoa's phenomenology of everyday life. While academic phenomenology, from Husserl to Heidegger, focused on abstract questions about consciousness and being, Pessoa practiced phenomenology through minute attention to ordinary experience. Soares describes in extraordinary detail the quality of afternoon light on Lisbon streets, the texture of boredom during office work, the specific feeling of watching strangers in cafes, the particular emptiness of Sunday afternoons. These descriptions achieve philosophical significance by revealing the strangeness of normal life. "I feel as if I'm always on the verge of waking," Soares writes. "I'm always sleepy with a sleep that isn't mine, as if the soul that inhabits me were dreaming me." This suggests that waking consciousness is itself a kind of dream. We think we're awake, aware, making choices. But we're actually dreaming while awake, moving through pre-scripted roles without awareness. True awakening would mean seeing through this dream, recognizing the fictive nature of everything we take as real. But complete awakening is impossible because the very structure of consciousness requires some degree of self-deception to operate. Pessoa also develops a sophisticated account of imagination's relationship to reality. For most people, imagination is secondary, a mental faculty that creates unreal images as opposed to perception, which delivers real ones. Pessoa argued the opposite. Imagination is more real than perception because it's more conscious. When you perceive something, your mind passively receives sensory data. When you imagine something, you actively create experience. The imagined is therefore more real because it's more deliberate, more aware. This has profound implications. If imagined experience is more real than lived experience, then the books never written are more real than the books written. The lives never lived are more real than the life lived. The possible is more real than the actual. Soares writes, "I've dreamed more than Napoleon accomplished. I've held closer to my hypothetical breast more humanities than Christ. I've made secret philosophies that no Kant ever wrote." These are not delusions of grandeur. They're claims about the ontological status of imagination. What exists only in consciousness has a higher grade of reality than what exists unconsciously in the external world. But this creates obvious problems. First, the verification problem. If imagined experience is more real than actual experience, how do you distinguish truth from fantasy? Pessoa's answer would be that this is a false distinction. All experience is fantasy. The question is not which experiences are real versus unreal, but which fantasies are conscious versus unconscious. But this eliminates any external standard for truth. Everything becomes subjective, internal, unprovable. Philosophy becomes impossible because philosophy requires shared reality to discuss. Second, the solipsism problem. If your imagined inner world is more real than the external world, why engage with others at all? Other people exist primarily in your imagination anyway. The actual person standing before you is less real than your idea of them. This leads to radical isolation. Pessoa lived this. He had few close relationships, avoided emotional intimacy, and spent most of his time alone writing. The philosophy that made his art possible made his life nearly unlivable. Third, the value problem. If actual achievement matters less than imagined achievement, all motivation for action disappears. Why actually write the book when the imagined book is more real? Why accomplish anything when imagining accomplishment suffices? Pessoa struggled with this throughout his life. He left thousands of fragments unfinished, hundreds of projects incomplete. His philosophy justified this incompletion by making actual completion less valuable than imagined completion. But this means his philosophy is fundamentally anti-productive. It undermines the conditions necessary for its own articulation. Fourth, scholars debate whether Pessoa actually believed his claims about imagination's superiority, or whether he was rationalizing his own failures. He published almost nothing during his lifetime, achieved little external recognition, lived in obscurity. His philosophy conveniently makes obscurity superior to fame, incompletion superior to completion, inner life superior to outer achievement. Critics suggest this is sophisticated self-justification, not genuine philosophy. Pessoa would likely respond that this criticism assumes the traditional hierarchy of values he rejected, but the suspicion remains. Fifth, the Book of Disquiet raises questions about authenticity that Pessoa never resolved. If Soares is a semi-heteronym, a partial fiction, How much of the book reflects Pessoa's actual beliefs versus Suarez's fictional ones? Pessoa describes Suarez as me without my rationalism and emotions, a mutilation of himself. But what does this mean? If Suarez is Pessoa minus certain qualities, are the remaining qualities truly Pessoa's? Or is even the supposedly authentic Pessoa just another construction? The text provides no answer because answering would require a stable authorial identity that Pessoa rejected. The philosophical power of the Book of Disquiet lies in its sustained demonstration that reality is less solid than we pretend, that fiction and fact interpenetrate constantly, that consciousness and dream are not opposites but neighbours, that the most intense experiences happen in imagination, not action, that life, as typically lived, is a form of sleepwalking from which most people never awaken. These insights remain philosophically valuable, even if they're practically catastrophic. But the book also reveals the limits of radical subjectivism. Yes, consciousness constructs much of what we call reality. Yes, imagination shapes experience profoundly. Yes, the self is less unified than traditional philosophy assume. But completely denying external reality, completely privileging imagination over action, completely fragmenting identity leads nowhere livable. Pessoa demonstrated this by living it. His philosophy was brilliant and true in important ways. It was also a recipe for isolation, paralysis, and eventual destruction. The question is whether you can accept the insights without accepting the consequences, whether you can see through the illusion while still functioning within it. Pessoa never found that balance. Perhaps it doesn't exist. Part 3. Consciousness, Self-Knowledge, and Phenomenology. Pessoa developed one of the 20th century's most radical accounts of consciousness, one that anticipated and in some ways exceeded phenomenology's insights while arriving through literary rather than academic methods. His fundamental claim: consciousness is not a unified field, but a multiplicity of perspectives, not a stable witness, but a constantly shifting viewpoint, not a transparent access to self-knowledge, but an elaborate mechanism for self-deception. Start with the problem of self-knowledge. The Socratic tradition assumed that knowing yourself is possible and desirable. You examine your beliefs, desires, and character. You reflect on your experiences and motivations. Through sustained introspection, you achieve clarity about who you are. Enlightenment philosophy built on this, claiming the thinking subject has privileged access to its own mental states. Descartes made this the foundation of certainty. I think, therefore, I am. Whatever else I doubt, I cannot doubt that I am doubting. Self-awareness is epistemology's bedrock. Pessoa dismantled this entirely. For him, the self that claims to know itself is already a fiction. There is no stable self to know. Consciousness is a parade of temporary coalescences, momentary organizational patterns that emerge and dissolve. What we call the self is a narrative we construct retrospectively to impose coherence on fundamentally incoherent experience. I realize that I was all error and deviation, Suarez writes, that I never lived, that I existed only insofar as I filled time with consciousness and thought. The supposedly solid self dissolves under examination into nothing but thinking about thinking, consciousness observing consciousness. This connects to what scholars call Pessoa's phenomenological method, though he never used the term. Phenomenology, as developed by Husserl, aimed to describe consciousness as it presents itself, bracketing questions about external reality to focus on the structures of experience. Pessoa did something similar but more radical. Where Husserl sought essential structures underlying all consciousness, Pessoa found only variation and multiplicity. Where Husserl assumed a transcendental ego organizing experience, Pessoa found a void where the ego should be. Consider his description of suddenly becoming conscious of himself. I'm dazed by a sarcastic terror of life, a despondency that exceeds the limits of my conscious being. I realize that I was all error and deviation, that I never lived, that I existed only insofar as I filled time with consciousness and thought. This sudden awareness of my true being, of this being that has always sleepily wandered between what it feels and what it sees, weighs on me like an untold sentence to serve. This passage reveals Pessoa's core insight about consciousness. It operates primarily to avoid seeing itself clearly. Ordinary consciousness is a kind of sleepwalking, a hypnotic state where you go through motions without awareness. Genuine self-awareness is rare, brief, and terrifying. When consciousness truly sees itself, it recognizes its own emptiness. There is no substantial self behind the parade of thoughts and sensations, just process, flux, change. The supposed unity of consciousness is a convenient lie. Consciousness tells itself to keep functioning. This has connections to Buddhist philosophy's doctrine of no self, though Pessoa arrived at it independently through Western philosophical tradition and personal experience. Buddhism claims the self is an illusion produced by attachment and ignorance. Liberation requires seeing through this illusion to the impersonal processes underlying experience. Pessoa reached similar conclusions but drew opposite practical implications. Where Buddhism offers meditation practices to dissolve the illusion and achieve peace, Pessoa offered heteronyms to multiply the illusion and achieve artistic productivity. Both recognize the self's fictional status. They differ on what to do about it. Pessoa also developed what could be called a philosophy of attention. Attention is not neutral. Where and how you direct attention shapes what appears in consciousness. Most people live in a kind of attention deficit, barely noticing experience as it occurs. They move through life half asleep, responding automatically to stimuli without awareness. Genuine consciousness requires sustained attention to attention itself, watching yourself watching, thinking about thinking. This meta-awareness is exhausting and usually impossible to maintain, but it's the only mode in which consciousness grasps its own nature. The heteronyms represent different attentional strategies. Cairo practices attention without thought, pure perception of sensory data without conceptual overlay. His attention aims to recover the immediacy of childlike consciousness before language and culture impose categories. The only mystery is there being someone who thinks about mystery, Cairo writes, dismissing all philosophical questioning in favour of direct sensation. For Cairo, consciousness becomes luminous when it stops interfering with perception, when thought dissolves into pure seeing. Race practices attention filtered through stoic acceptance. He attends to experience while maintaining emotional distance, observing pleasure and pain with equal detachment. His attention includes awareness of mortality, fate, and the futility of resistance. This produces a melancholic but tranquil consciousness that accepts everything because it expects nothing. See life from a distance, Reyes advises. Never question it. There's nothing it can tell you. Consciousness here becomes wise through withdrawal, through refusing engagement that would disturb its equilibrium. Campos practices attention as overwhelming intensity. His attention tries to grasp everything simultaneously, to feel all sensations at once, to contain all possible experiences. This produces manic expansion followed by depressive collapse. I want to be everybody, Campos declares in his early work. But the attempt to extend consciousness infinitely results in fragmentation and exhaustion. Later, he writes, I'm nothing. I'll never be anything. I can't want to be anything. Apart from that, I have in me all the dreams of the world. Consciousness, pushed to maximum intensity, breaks apart. These three strategies map different possibilities for how consciousness can orient itself toward experience. Direct perception without thought, stoic detachment with awareness of limits, manic expansion toward infinite possibility. Each has advantages and costs. Each reveals something true about consciousness while excluding other truths. Pessoa's brilliance was recognizing that no single attentional strategy captures the full range of conscious experience. You need multiple perspectives, multiple selves, multiple ways of being conscious. But this raises the binding problem. If consciousness is fundamentally multiple, what creates even temporary unity? How do these different attentional modes coordinate? When Pessoa writes as Cairo versus Race versus Campos, something switches. Some meta-level process selects which heteronym to activate. But what is that process? If there's no unified self, what does the switching? Pessoa never answered this. His philosophy describes multiplicity brilliantly, but cannot explain how multiplicity organizes itself even temporarily. Scholars connect Pessoa's account of consciousness to several philosophical traditions. The Nietzschean comparison is obvious. Nietzsche also attacked the unified self, claiming it thinks rather than I think, making consciousness an impersonal process rather than personal activity. Both rejected the Cartesian subject and the Christian soul. Both emphasized will to power or will to create as primary over rational deliberation. Both used literary philosophical methods rather than systematic argumentation. But Nietzsche maintained a vision of self-overcoming, of creating yourself through disciplined effort. Pessoa offered no such project. His heteronyms don't overcome anything. They simply exist in parallel, each complete in itself. The comparison to William James's psychology is also instructive. James described consciousness as a stream, constantly flowing, never identical from moment to moment. He rejected the idea of a substantial self behind experience, proposing instead that the self is just the current thought appropriating previous thoughts. Pessoa agreed, but went further. James still assumed one stream per person. Pessoa demonstrated multiple streams, fundamentally different currents of consciousness operating within a single biological organism. This is either a profound extension of James's insights or a confusion between literary technique and psychological reality. Some scholars connect Pessoa to later developments in consciousness studies and cognitive science. The modular mind hypothesis proposes that human cognition consists of multiple semi-independent processing systems, not a unified central processor. Different modules handle perception, language, memory, social cognition. These modules can conflict, producing the sense of internal disagreement or uncertainty. Pessoa's heteronyms might be literary expressions of actual cognitive architecture, exaggerated for artistic purposes but based in real features of how minds work. Or they might be purely invented, bearing no relationship to actual mental structure. The empirical evidence doesn't clearly favour either interpretation. The practical problem with Pessoa's account of consciousness is that it makes decision-making impossible. If consciousness is fundamentally multiple, with no stable self to make choices, how does anyone decide anything? Every choice requires believing that the person choosing is the same person who will experience the consequences. But if identity is discontinuous, choice becomes arbitrary. Why should the self existing now sacrifice for a different self that will exist tomorrow? Pessoa lived this problem. He famously struggled with decision-making, often unable to complete tasks or commit to plans. His philosophy explained why decision-making is philosophically dubious, but offered no practical alternative. Another issue. Pessoa's account makes communication problematic. Language assumes the speaker intends meaning that a listener can recover. But if there's no stable speaker, just shifting perspectives and fragmentary selves, communication becomes accident rather than achievement. You might think you're communicating Cairo's views, but race interrupts, and Campos misunderstands, and Pessoa himself doesn't exist to adjudicate. The text means whatever the current reader and current writer self construct together. This is creative but anarchic. It destroys the possibility of stable meaning. The deepest issue is the performative contradiction built into Pessoa's philosophy. He claims there is no unified self, but someone had to organize the heteronyms, create their biographies, distribute poems among them, and maintain the system over decades. That coordinating activity requires exactly the kind of unity Pessoa denied. You might say the heteronyms emerged spontaneously, that Pessoa was genuinely multiple, but even spontaneous emergence of distinct personalities requires some biological substrate maintaining continuity, providing the platform on which personalities appear. Pessoa's philosophy cannot account for its own conditions of possibility. Yet, despite these problems, Pessoa's phenomenology of consciousness remains philosophically valuable. He demonstrated through sustained literary practice that consciousness is far stranger and more multiple than traditional philosophy acknowledged. That self-knowledge is not transparent access to inner truth, but recursive process of observation creating what it observes. That attention shapes experience more than we typically recognize. That the supposedly unified self is actually a collection of competing voices and perspectives loosely coordinated through narrative. These insights survive even if the extreme conclusions don't. The question is whether you can accept consciousness's multiplicity without concluding there's no self at all. Whether you can recognize identity's constructed nature without denying continuity entirely. Whether you can acknowledge the heterogeneity of inner experience without fragmenting into paralysis. Pessoa pushed consciousness studies to its logical extreme and discovered that extreme consciousness cannot maintain itself. Perhaps moderate consciousness, partially aware of its own nature but not completely transparent to itself, is the only sustainable mode. Full self-knowledge might be impossible not because we lack the capacity, but because consciousness cannot function under complete self-scrutiny. The self that knows itself completely ceases to be a self at all. Part 4. Sensationism and Aesthetic Philosophy. Sensationism represents Pessoa's most systematic attempt to articulate a philosophical foundation for modernist art. Developed in the early 1910s alongside his friend Mario de Sacarneiro, sensationism proposed a new aesthetic grounded in the primacy of sensation over thought, multiplicity over unity, and artistic construction over natural expression. Though Pessoa wrote manifestos and theoretical essays explaining it, sensationism is best understood through the practice of the heteronyms themselves. The core principle: all art begins and ends in sensation. Not ideas, not emotions, not moral lessons or political messages, but immediate sensory experience. The artwork's purpose is not to represent reality or express feeling, but to create sensation in the perceiver. Traditional aesthetics assumed art imitates nature or reveals truth. Romantic aesthetics assumed art expresses the artist's genuine emotion. Sensationism rejected both. Art is neither imitation nor expression. Art is sensation construction. This builds on, but radicalizes empiricist philosophy. Empiricists like Locke and Hume claimed all knowledge derives from sensory experience. Abstract ideas are combinations of simple sensations. The mind has no innate content, only the capacity to organize sensory data. Pessoa accepted this, but pushed beyond epistemology into aesthetics. If all knowledge comes from sensation, and art is a kind of knowledge, then art must maximize sensory intensity and variety. The greatest art produces the most sensations in the most ways. Pessoa distinguished three aspects of sensationist art: sensation, suggestion, and construction. Sensation is the immediate sensory impact, the direct perceptual effect the artwork produces. This could be visual, auditory, tactile, or the complex synesthetic combinations modernist art explored. Suggestion is the capacity to evoke sensations beyond those directly presented, to trigger chains of association that multiply the initial sensory effect. Construction is the deliberate artistic organization that creates and controls these sensory and suggestive effects. Not spontaneous expression, but careful architecture. Consider how the heteronyms embody these principles. Cairo focuses almost entirely on direct sensation. His poems present pure perception without interpretation. The Tagus is more beautiful than the river running through my village, but the Tagus is not more beautiful than the river running through my village, because the Tagus is not the river running through my village. No metaphor, no abstraction, just the irreducible specificity of sensory experience. Each sensation is complete in itself, incomparable to others, resistant to conceptual categorization. This is sensation without suggestion, immediate without construction. Reyes adds suggestion through classical allusion and mythological reference. His poems are densely layered with references to Greek and Roman culture, making each line evoke networks of association. You read about rivers and think of Lethe, about roses and remember Tempus Fugit, about gods and recall entire cosmologies. Suggestion multiplies sensation exponentially, but Reyes also emphasizes construction. His poems follow strict classical meters, elaborate stanza patterns, and sophisticated rhetorical structures. Every word is carefully positioned. Nothing is spontaneous. The effect of naturalness is itself constructed. Campos represents maximum intensity on all three dimensions. His early odes produce overwhelming sensory bombardment. Mechanical noises, industrial landscapes, crowds, speed, machinery, chaos. The sensations come too fast to process individually, creating an experience of sensory overload. The suggestion is equally intense, with references to technology, imperialism, modernity, fragmentation cascading through the poems, and the construction appears chaotic, but is actually controlled, using free verse that seems spontaneous but follows careful patterns of acceleration and deceleration. Sensationism also involves what Pessoa called depersonalization. Traditional aesthetics valued sincerity, authenticity, the artist expressing genuine feeling. Sensationism reversed this. The goal is not to express yourself, but to eliminate yourself. The artist should disappear into the artwork, becoming a pure medium through which sensations pass. This is why the heteronyms matter aesthetically. They allow complete depersonalization. Pessoa doesn't express his feelings. He creates fictional persons who create sensations. The artwork becomes autonomous, freed from biographical explanation or authorial intention. This connects to broader modernist developments. Itsunsonism, T.S. Eliot's theory of impersonality, developed independently around the same time, makes similar claims. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion, not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. Ezra Pound's imagism demanded direct treatment of the thing, no unnecessary words, no abstraction. Futurism celebrated technological sensation and mechanical aesthetics. Sensationism fits this broader modernist rejection of romantic self-expression in favour of constructed artefact. But Pessoa's version has distinctive features. Where Eliot's impersonality still assumes a unified tradition that individual poets serve, Pessoa's depersonalization fragments tradition into multiple, incompatible perspectives. Where Pound's imagism seeks the exact word for the exact thing, Pessoa's sensationism multiplies perspectives to show there is no exact thing, only different ways of sensing. Where Futurism celebrated one kind of sensation, modern industrial experience, Pessoa demonstrated that sensation itself is multiple, that different sensory modes produce different realities. The aesthetic implications are profound. If art is sensation construction rather than self-expression, traditional criteria for evaluation dissolve. You cannot judge art by sincerity, because sincerity is irrelevant. You cannot judge by truth to reality, because art creates reality rather than reflecting it. You cannot judge by emotional impact, because emotion is just one type of sensation among many. The only criterion becomes, does the artwork successfully create intense, multiple, sustained sensations? This is simultaneously liberating and anarchic. Liberating because it opens art to unlimited experimentation. Anarchic because it provides no stable standards for judgment. Pessoa also developed ideas about the relationship between different art forms. Traditional aesthetics treated painting, music, poetry, sculpture as separate domains with different rules. Sensationism suggests they're all varieties of sensation construction, differing in medium but identical in principle. This opens possibility for synesthetic art that combines modes. Pessoa experimented with this, writing poems that aimed for musical effects, describing paintings verbally, creating verbal equivalents of visual abstraction. The heteronyms themselves function synesthetically, each one a different sensory mode for experiencing reality. But sensationism faces severe philosophical problems. First, the relativism problem. If all art is equally valid, as long as it creates sensation, how do you distinguish good art from bad? Pessoa never provided satisfactory answer. He would likely say the question is wrongly posed, that good and bad are obsolete categories. But this makes criticism impossible. You can describe sensations artworks produce, but cannot evaluate them. This reduces aesthetics to psychology, cataloguing effects without assessing value. Second, the communication problem. If art is pure sensation construction without expressive intention, what enables communication between artist and audience? Traditional aesthetics assumed art communicates meaning, feeling, or vision from artist to viewer. Sensationism denies this. But if nothing is communicated, why create art at all? Pessoa might answer that sensation itself is what's transmitted. But sensations are inherently subjective. The sensation you experience viewing an artwork differs radically from anyone else's. So what exactly is shared? Third, the meaning problem. Sensationism seems to eliminate semantic content, treating artworks as pure sensory stimulus. But Pessoa's poetry is intensely meaningful. The heteronyms make philosophical claims, express worldviews, articulate positions. How does this square with pure sensationism? Pessoa would probably say the meanings are themselves sensations, that conceptual content is a variety of mental sensation. But this stretches the term sensation beyond recognition. If everything is sensation, the term loses specificity and explanatory power. Fourth, the originality problem. Sensationism claims to offer a completely new aesthetic. But is it really new? Aestheticism in the late 1800s, especially Oscar Wilde and Walter Pater, already emphasized sensation over meaning. All art is quite useless, Wilde declared, meaning art needs no justification beyond sensory pleasure. Art for art's sake already rejected moral content and social purpose. What does sensationism add? Pessoa would say the systematic application, the theoretical foundation in empiricist philosophy, and the multiplication through heteronyms. But critics can reasonably argue it's more continuation than revolution. Fifth, scholars debate whether Pessoa's actual poetry succeeds on sensationist terms. Take Cairo. His poems claim to present pure sensation without thought, but they're written in language, which is inherently conceptual. You cannot use words to escape words. Every description of sensation already interprets and categorizes it. The claim to pure perception is itself a thought about perception, contradicting its own premise. Reis faces similar problems. His poems evoke classical associations, but associations are thoughts, not sensations. Campos's bombardment of imagery still relies on linguistic meaning to convey sensory chaos. The theory can't be implemented in poetic practice because poetry is linguistic and language is conceptual. Sixth, the psychological question. Do humans actually experience pure sensation? Modern cognitive science suggests not. Perception is always already interpreted. The brain doesn't receive raw sensory data and then interpret it. Interpretation happens simultaneously with sensation, embedded in perceptual processing. There is no sensation without conception, no perception without categorization. Pessoa's aesthetic assumes a phenomenology that psychology doesn't support. You cannot create pure sensation because pure sensation doesn't exist. Despite these problems, sensationism contributed valuable insights to aesthetic theory. It emphasized sensation's primacy in artistic experience, which had been neglected in favor of meaning and emotion. It recognized that artworks construct reality rather than reflecting it, anticipating constructivist approaches in aesthetics. It valued multiplicity over unity, opening space for fragmentation and contradiction in art. It demonstrated through practice that a single artist could produce radically different styles by adopting different sensory orientations. These contributions remain valuable even if the extreme theoretical claims fail. The practical legacy of sensationism appears in how it enabled Pessoa's actual poetry. Whatever the philosophical problems, the heteronyms produced extraordinary work precisely by applying sensationist principles. Cairo's poems achieve remarkable clarity and freshness by stripping away conceptual overlay. Reis's classical precision creates haunting meditations on time and mortality. Campos's explosive energy captures modernity's sensory intensity and psychological cost. The aesthetic theory worked artistically even if it failed philosophically. This suggests that philosophical coherence and artistic productivity are different things, that an incoherent theory can enable great art. The question is whether sensationism tells us something true about art or only about Pessoa's art. Does it reveal universal principles or describe one peculiar case? Pessoa believed he had discovered fundamental truths about aesthetic experience. Most scholars think he described his own creative process and mistook it for general law. The heteronyms worked for him because of his particular psychology, not because they embody necessary artistic principles. Other artists create successfully through completely different methods. Sincerity works for confessional poets. Unity works for classical artists. Expression works for romantics. Sensationism is one option among many, valuable for some artists, but not universal. Perhaps the deepest issue is that sensationism, like all of Pessoa's philosophy, pushes insights to extremes that make them collapse. Yes, sensation matters in art, but so do meaning, emotion, form, tradition, innovation. Yes, depersonalization can be productive, but so can authentic expression. Yes, multiplicity expands possibility, but so does sustained focus on one vision. Sensationism captures important truths about aesthetic experience while exaggerating them into a totalizing theory that cannot account for art's actual diversity. The value lies in the partial insights, not the complete system. Part 5. Political Philosophy and the Fifth Empire. Pessoa's political thought remains controversial and contradictory, mixing reactionary nationalism with anarchist individualism, messianic prophecy with cynical realism, esoteric mysticism with concrete policy proposals. At the centre lies the concept of the Fifth Empire, a mystical vision of Portugal's future cultural and spiritual dominion over humanity. Understanding this requires examining both the political context of early 20th century Portugal and the esoteric traditions Pessoa drew upon. Portugal in Pessoa's lifetime experienced extreme instability. The monarchy fell in 1910, replaced by a republican government that lurched between factions. Political assassinations, military coups, and constant upheaval characterized the First Republic. Pessoa watched this chaos with contempt. He despised republican democracy, considering it mob rule by the incompetent. He despised socialism and communism, which he saw as threats to individual liberty. He briefly supported the military dictatorship of Sidonio Pais, even writing a poem celebrating him as a mythic figure. After Pais's assassination in 1918, Pessoa became increasingly pessimistic about Portugal's political future. The Fifth Empire concept offered an alternative to this present degradation. Drawing on the prophecies of 16th-century Portuguese mystics like Goncalo Anes Bandara and 17th-century Jesuit Antonio Vieira, Pessoa envisioned Portugal leading humanity into a new age of cultural and spiritual synthesis. Not through military conquest or economic power, Portugal had lost those, but through language, culture, and mystical insight. The Portuguese language would become, in Pessoa's phrase, the language of the future, spreading Portuguese spiritual values globally. This built on a long Portuguese tradition called Sebastianism. King Sebastian disappeared in battle in 1578, and legends arose that he would return to restore Portugal's glory. This messianic belief persisted for centuries, particularly among common people. Vieira reinterpreted it intellectually, proposing that the Fifth Empire prophesied in the biblical book of Daniel would be Portuguese, succeeding the Assyrian, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires. Pessoa adopted and modified this, making the Fifth Empire not territorial but spiritual and cultural. In Pessoa's scheme, history progresses through 5 empires, each contributing something essential. Greece provided knowledge and philosophy, Rome expanded Greek culture and law, Christianity synthesized Greco-Roman civilization with Eastern elements, Europe, and specifically the British Empire, spread this synthesis worldwide through English individualism and commerce. The Fifth Empire would complete this progression by achieving ultimate synthesis of material and spiritual knowledge, reason and mysticism, Western and Eastern wisdom. Portugal would lead this because Portuguese culture preserved connections to older spiritual traditions while remaining open to modernity. His only book published during his lifetime, Message, articulates this vision through 44 short poems celebrating Portuguese history and prophecy. The book's 3 sections trace Portuguese destiny, from mythic origins through historical greatness to future fulfillment. The 3rd section, the hidden one, explicitly invokes the Fifth Empire, using King Sebastian as symbol of the messianic figure, who will inaugurate the new age. The hidden one also links to esoteric tradition, referring to secret knowledge preserved by initiates who will reveal it when the time is right. Pessoa took this seriously. He studied astrology extensively, creating birth charts to predict Portugal's destiny. He investigated Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, Freemasonry, and various occult traditions, believing they preserved esoteric wisdom necessary for the Fifth Empire's manifestation. He wrote detailed theoretical texts proposing how Portuguese cultural policy should prepare for this future. He saw his own literary work, especially the heteronyms, as contributing to the Fifth Empire by demonstrating Portugal's cultural sophistication and philosophical depth. But here is where Pessoa's political thought becomes deeply problematic. His nationalism easily shaded into xenophobia. He wrote disparagingly about Africans, Asians, and various European peoples. He considered Portuguese culture superior to others, destined for spiritual leadership by divine providence or historical necessity. He supported authoritarianism, arguing that democracy empowers mediocrity while dictatorship can elevate the exceptional. He praised certain aspects of fascism, particularly its corporatist economics and rejection of parliamentary democracy. He opposed universal suffrage, believing most people lack the intelligence to govern. Scholars debate how seriously to take these positions. Some argue Pessoa was a right-wing authoritarian whose philosophy justifies dangerous political ideas. Others argue his positions were more complex, that he opposed Salazar's regime despite earlier support for dictatorship, that his individualism contradicted totalitarianism, that his mysticism was personal rather than political. The truth seems to be that Pessoa held contradictory political views that he never integrated coherently. On one hand, radical individualism, Pessoa advocated minimal state interference, maximal personal freedom, and rejection of collective identity beyond voluntary association. He wrote that the state that governs best is the state that governs least, echoing anarchist sentiment. He despised mass movements, collective enthusiasm, and subordination of individual to group. He celebrated the solitary intellectual who pursues truth regardless of social approval. This strand of his thought is libertarian, opposed to all forms of collectivism. On the other hand, authoritarian nationalism, Pessoa advocated strong leadership by exceptional individuals who could guide the ignorant masses. He supported hierarchy, order, and traditional values against democratic levelling. He believed in Portugal's historical mission and cultural superiority. He thought prophetic insight and esoteric knowledge should guide political decisions rather than popular will. He wanted Portugal to reclaim its lost greatness through cultural and spiritual imperialism. This strand is reactionary, elitist, and potentially fascist. These contradictions never resolved. Pessoa seems to have wanted an anarchist society for exceptional individuals like himself, combined with authoritarian control of everyone else. He wanted freedom for the spiritual aristocracy and discipline for the masses. He wanted Portugal to dominate culturally while individuals within Portugal pursue solitary paths. This is incoherent as political philosophy, but psychologically revealing. Pessoa identified with the exceptional and despised the ordinary, wanted recognition for his genius while avoiding social engagement, dreamed of collective greatness while living in isolation. The Fifth Empire concept specifically faces several devastating critiques. First, the empirical problem. There is no evidence Portugal will or could lead a global spiritual transformation. Portugal in Pessoa's time was declining, politically unstable, economically backward, losing its colonies. Nothing suggested imminent cultural dominance. Pessoa recognized this, which is why he made the Fifth Empire spiritual rather than material. But spiritual influence is even harder to verify. How would you know if Portugal achieved spiritual leadership? By what measure? Pessoa provided no answer beyond mystical assertion. Second, the historical problem. The pattern Pessoa identified in previous empires is questionable. Did Greece really provide all knowledge? Did Rome merely spread Greek culture? Did Christianity synthesize them completely? Did Europe succeed Christianity rather than developing within it? Did British individualism represent Europe's contribution? Historians would dispute all these claims. Pessoa's historical narrative is mythological, not factual. It projects his desires backward to find precedent for predictions forward. Third, The linguistic problem. Pessoa claimed Portuguese would become the language of the future. Why? Portuguese was and remains a minor world language compared to English, Spanish, Chinese, Arabic. Brazil has more Portuguese speakers than Portugal, and Brazil was developing independently with different cultural priorities. The linguistic claim makes no sense unless you believe in mystical language properties, that Portuguese somehow embodies spiritual truths other languages cannot express. But this is language mysticism, not linguistics. Fourth, the colonial problem. Portugal maintained colonies in Africa and Asia throughout Pessoa's life. The Fifth Empire concept relies on Portugal's historical role as colonizer and implies continued Portuguese cultural influence over former colonies. But colonialism involved exploitation, slavery, violence, and cultural destruction. The notion that Portugal should lead a spiritual empire carries colonial assumptions about European superiority and the civilizing mission. Post-colonial critics rightly identify this as imperialist ideology dressed in mystical language. Fifth, the fascism problem. While Pessoa's relationship to fascism is complex, the Fifth Empire concept shares fascist characteristics. It emphasizes national greatness, historical mission, the need for strong leadership, the value of hierarchy, and the superiority of one people over others. It uses mystical and mythological justifications for political goals. It combines reactionary content with revolutionary rhetoric. These are fascist tropes. Pessoa might object that his nationalism was cultural, not racial, spiritual, not material. But the distinction matters less than the underlying structure of thinking. Sixth, scholars debate whether the Fifth Empire represents genuine political vision or literary mythology. Did Pessoa actually believe Portugal would achieve global spiritual leadership? Or was it a poetic conceit, a mythological framework for artistic production? His astrological predictions suggest genuine belief. But his ironic distance in other writings suggests awareness that mythology and reality differ. Perhaps he inhabited both positions simultaneously, believing and not believing, treating the Fifth Empire as real prophecy and useful fiction. The practical political implications of Pessoa's thought are minimal. He influenced no movements, proposed no concrete policies that were implemented, left no political legacy beyond his writings. His politics matter primarily for understanding his philosophy and poetry, not for actual political impact. But they do reveal how philosophical brilliance can coexist with political stupidity, how linguistic genius can produce ideological nonsense, how personal isolation can generate grandiose collective fantasies. The question is whether you can separate Pessoa's valuable philosophical insights about identity and consciousness from his problematic political views. Many scholars say yes, that his metaphysics and aesthetics stand independently of his nationalism. Others argue the connections run deeper, that the same impulse to fragment the self appears in his nationalist mythology, that his political thought reveals authoritarianism implicit in his philosophy. The debate continues without resolution. What seems clear is that Pessoa's political thought represents his philosophy's failure when applied to collective life. His insights about individual consciousness, identity's multiplicity, and the fictional nature of self do not scale to politics. Nations are not like persons. Collective identity requires precisely the unified narrative Pessoa's philosophy undermines. Political action demands commitment, his skepticism prevents. Social life needs stability, his multiplicity destroys. His attempt to think politically produced either contradictory nonsense or dangerous mysticism. The philosopher of fragmentation could not imagine coherent collective existence. Perhaps this reveals philosophy's limits. Some questions require answers that transcend individual consciousness. Political philosophy must account for how millions coordinate action, share meaning, and build institutions. Pessoa's radical individualism and skepticism about unified identity make such accounting impossible. His philosophy works brilliantly for understanding one strange person's inner life. It fails completely at explaining how people live together. The political thought is where the philosophy's practical bankruptcy becomes undeniable. Part 6. Esotericism, Mysticism, and Symbolic Thinking. Pessoa's engagement with esoteric traditions, occult practices, and mystical philosophy represents one of his thought's most neglected dimensions. While scholars focus on his literary modernism and philosophical insights, they often downplay or ignore his serious lifelong study of astrology, Rosicrucianism, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, Theosophy, and various Western esoteric currents. Yet Pessoa himself considered this dimension essential, not peripheral. His mysticism was not metaphorical or ironic. He genuinely believed in astral influences, spiritual hierarchies, and hidden knowledge accessible only to initiates. The key to understanding this is Pessoa's commitment to symbolic thinking. He wrote early on, "My thinking is condemned to symbol and analogy." For most people trained in scientific rationalism, this is a limitation. Symbolic thinking is pre-scientific, a primitive mode that science supersedes. Pessoa reversed this valuation. He considered symbolic thinking superior to rational analysis because symbols capture relationships that discursive reason misses. Symbols reveal connections, analogies, and correspondences that rational thought, with its demand for literal truth and logical consistency, cannot grasp. This connects to Hermetic philosophy's core principle: as above, so below. The universe is organized through correspondences between different levels of reality. What happens in the celestial realm reflects in the terrestrial. What occurs in the macrocosm mirrors in the microcosm. Understanding requires recognizing these correspondences, seeing patterns that connect apparently unrelated phenomena. Rational analysis separates things into categories. Symbolic thinking reveals the hidden unity underlying apparent diversity. Pessoa applied this systematically to astrology. He didn't practice astrology casually or recreationally. He cast hundreds of elaborate horoscopes, calculated planetary positions precisely, and wrote detailed astrological analyses. He created birth charts for himself, his heteronyms, historical figures, and Portugal itself. He predicted political events, personal fortunes, and cultural developments based on astrological configurations. He considered astrology a genuine science, more reliable than history or sociology for understanding human affairs. His commitment to astrology wasn't superstition. It followed from his philosophical premises. If consciousness is multiple and identity fragmented, what unifies experience? Pessoa's answer: astrological influences provide coherence. Your birth chart describes the configuration of celestial forces present at your beginning. These forces shape your character, determine possibilities, and constrain outcomes. They don't eliminate free will entirely, but establish parameters within which freedom operates. The heteronyms each had birth charts because they each required different astrological foundations to explain their different personalities. He also engaged deeply with Rosicrucianism, a mystical Christian tradition claiming to possess secret wisdom from ancient initiates. Rosicrucians believe in spiritual evolution, esoteric Christianity, and the approaching transformation of humanity into higher consciousness. They use alchemical symbolism, geometric mysticism, and elaborate mythological narratives. Pessoa absorbed all this, incorporating it into his vision of the Fifth Empire. The Fifth Empire wasn't just political fantasy. It was Rosicrucian prophecy, the age of spiritual transformation that esoteric tradition predicted. He studied sacred geometry extensively, believing geometric forms possessed mystical significance. Circles, triangles, squares, and complex geometric patterns weren't merely mathematical abstractions. They were archetypes expressing divine structure. The universe itself is geometrically organized, and understanding these patterns provides access to fundamental reality. His poetry frequently uses geometric imagery, not decoratively, but philosophically, expressing truths that discursive language cannot articulate. Pessoa also investigated Kabbalah, Jewish mystical tradition focused on the structure of divine emanation and the hidden meanings in sacred texts. Kabbalistic concepts like the Tree of Life, the Sephiroth, and the idea that reality consists of multiple interpenetrating levels influenced his thinking about consciousness and identity. The heteronyms might be understood Kabbalistically as different Sephiroth, different aspects of divine consciousness expressed through human personality. He joined and was initiated into Freemasonry, though the extent of his involvement remains debated. Masonic symbolism appears throughout his work. The emphasis on hidden knowledge, gradual initiation, symbolic ritual, and spiritual brotherhood aligned with his worldview. He also engaged with theosophy, Helena Blavatsky's syncretic spiritual system combining Eastern and Western mysticism. Theosophical ideas about karma, reincarnation, spiritual hierarchies, and evolutionary consciousness appear in his writings. The question scholars struggle with: did Pessoa actually believe this? Was his mysticism genuine spiritual conviction or elaborate intellectual play? The evidence suggests genuine belief combined with intellectual sophistication. He took esoteric practices seriously, devoted enormous time to occult study, and wrote sincerely about spiritual realities. But he also maintained ironic distance, recognized the symbolic nature of mystical claims, and avoided dogmatic assertion. Perhaps he believed and disbelieved simultaneously, treating esoteric knowledge as both literally true and mythologically meaningful. This connects to his broader philosophy. If reality is fundamentally unknowable through reason alone, alternative modes of knowledge become necessary. Mysticism offers intuitive access to truths reason cannot reach. Symbols communicate realities that literal language distorts. Esoteric tradition preserves wisdom that rational philosophy forgot. The heteronyms themselves function esoterically, each one a different initiation into a different mode of being, different way of sensing reality. Creating and inhabiting heteronyms is a spiritual practice, not just literary technique, but this raises serious philosophical problems. First, the verification problem. How do you distinguish genuine esoteric insight from delusion? If mystical knowledge cannot be rationally verified, what prevents believing anything? Pessoa would answer that verification comes through lived experience, through inhabiting symbolic structures and discovering they illuminate reality. But this is subjective validation, convincing only to the person experiencing it. It provides no intersubjective standard. Second, the selectivity problem. Pessoa drew on multiple incompatible esoteric traditions. Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, and Theosophy make conflicting claims about spiritual reality. How did he decide which elements to accept? He seems to have practiced syncretism, combining whatever seemed useful while ignoring contradictions. But this makes his mysticism incoherent. You cannot simultaneously believe Jewish and Christian and Hindu cosmologies unless you treat all as symbolic, not literal. But then what are they symbols of? Pessoa never clarified. Third, the effectiveness problem. Did Pessoa's occult practices actually work? His astrological predictions were often wrong. His magical rituals produced no observable effects. His prophecies about Portugal's Fifth Empire went unfulfilled. From an empirical standpoint, his mysticism failed. He might respond that spiritual effects are internal, not external, that the value lies in psychological transformation, not material outcomes. But this concedes that occultism doesn't affect external reality, making it indistinguishable from placebo or self-delusion. Fourth, the political problem discussed earlier. Esoteric elitism easily becomes political elitism. If some people possess hidden knowledge unavailable to the masses, those initiates deserve power over the uninitiated. This justifies hierarchy, authoritarianism, and contempt for democratic equality. Pessoa's mysticism and his politics reinforce each other problematically. The spiritual aristocracy should rule the ignorant majority. Fifth, scholars debate whether Pessoa's mysticism represents authentic spirituality or compensatory fantasy. His life was lonely, unsuccessful, unfulfilled. Mystical belief provided meaning his actual existence lacked. The secret knowledge, spiritual importance, and prophetic mission compensated for worldly failure. This is psychologically explicable, but doesn't validate the mystical claims. Many people turn to occultism when conventional life disappoints them. This doesn't prove occultism is true, only that it's psychologically useful for certain personalities. Sixth, the problem of symbolic thinking itself. Symbols are inherently ambiguous. They can mean anything to anyone. Geometric patterns, astrological configurations, and mythological narratives admit endless interpretations. There are no fixed meanings, no objective truths expressed symbolically. Different interpreters extract different meanings, all equally valid or invalid. This makes symbolic thinking useless for genuine knowledge, however valuable for artistic creation or psychological exploration. Despite these problems, Pessoa's mysticism contributed to his philosophical and artistic achievement. His symbolic thinking enabled the heteronyms. Each one expresses a different symbolic constellation, a different way of organizing experience through mythological and archetypal patterns. His rejection of literal rationalism opened conceptual space for radical experimentation. His belief in hidden connections and multiple levels of reality informed his metaphysics of identity and consciousness. The mysticism and the philosophy reinforce each other, both rooted in rejection of scientific materialism and rational unity. The contemporary question is whether you can salvage anything valuable from Pessoa's esotericism. Most scholars treat it as biographical curiosity, interesting for understanding the man, but irrelevant to assessing his philosophy. Others argue it's essential, that removing the mysticism misrepresents his thought fundamentally. Perhaps the answer is that his mysticism generated powerful metaphors and symbolic structures that work aesthetically, even if they fail literally. The astrological and hermetic frameworks enabled creative productivity without needing to be factually true. The value lies in the literary and philosophical results, not the occult premises. This suggests a pragmatic approach. Judge mysticism by its fruits rather than its truth. If symbolic thinking produces insight, use it regardless of whether the symbols literally correspond to reality. If astrological frameworks generate useful personality descriptions, employ them whether or not planets actually influence character. If esoteric traditions provide meaningful life narratives, adopt them, even if their metaphysical claims are false. This is how Pessoa seems to have actually operated, pragmatically deploying mystical concepts for philosophical and artistic purposes. But this pragmatic approach has costs. It treats mysticism as useful fiction rather than genuine knowledge, which is exactly what mystics would reject. It removes the truth claims that make mysticism mysticism. It reduces everything to subjective psychology or aesthetic preference. Perhaps some positions require commitment beyond pragmatic utility. Perhaps mysticism demands believing, not just using. If so, Pessoa's sophisticated ironic mysticism might be an impossible position, wanting spiritual meaning without spiritual conviction, desiring hidden knowledge without accepting any knowledge as finally true. The mystic who doubts his mysticism might be as contradictory as the philosopher who doubts philosophy. Part 7. Modernism and Literary Innovation. Pessoa stands as one of modernism's most radical practitioners, yet his relationship to modernist movements was peculiar. He participated in Portuguese modernism's founding moments, co-founding the journal Orfeu in 1915, which scandalized Lisbon's literary establishment. But he remained isolated from international modernist networks, rarely travelling, publishing little, and engaging minimally with contemporary writers. His modernism developed largely independently, converging with European and American developments through parallel innovation rather than direct influence. The Orfeu scandal deserves attention because it reveals how Pessoa's work challenged even avant-garde expectations. The journal published 2 issues containing experimental poetry, provocative manifestos, and deliberately offensive material designed to shock bourgeois sensibilities. The critics attacked it viciously, calling the contributors lunatics and degenerates. This was precisely the reaction Pessoa wanted. Modernism meant rejecting not just traditional aesthetic forms, but the entire cultural framework supporting them. Shocking the middle class was philosophical demonstration, not mere provocation. It proved that conventional taste rested on arbitrary prejudice rather than genuine aesthetic judgment. But Pessoa's modernism differed from other varieties in crucial ways. Italian futurism, which influenced his heteronym Álvaro de Campos, celebrated speed, violence, machinery, and war. It was aggressively masculinist, politically reactionary, and aesthetically simplistic. Pessoa absorbed the energy but rejected the ideology. His Campos writes odes to machinery, but ends in depression and alienation, demonstrating that technological modernity produces psychological destruction, not liberation. The futurist enthusiasm is revealed as manic delusion covering existential void. French surrealism, which developed in the 1920s, explored unconscious mind, automatic writing, and dream logic. Pessoa practiced automatic writing extensively and investigated psychological fragmentation. But where surrealists sought to access a deeper authentic self beneath social conditioning, Pessoa found no self at all, just competing fragments. Surrealism aimed at liberation through unconscious expression. Pessoa demonstrated that the unconscious is as multiple and constructed as consciousness. There is no authentic depth to access, only different layers of fiction. English and American modernism, particularly T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, emphasized impersonality, formal innovation, and engagement with tradition through radical reinterpretation. Eliot's The Wasteland fragments narrative, mixes registers, and quotes multiple languages and cultures, creating collage structure from cultural debris. Pessoa's method was more extreme. Where Eliot maintained one authorial voice, orchestrating multiple perspectives, Pessoa created genuinely different authors. Where Eliot quoted tradition, Pessoa embodied it through heteronyms, writing in different historical styles. James Joyce's experiments with narrative perspective and interior monologue in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake parallel Pessoa's heteronymic method. Both fragment unified narrative consciousness into competing voices. Both treat identity as linguistically constructed, produced through different speech patterns and thought patterns. Both push modernist innovation toward limits where literature threatens to collapse into incomprehensibility. But Joyce maintained biographical unity, one Irish writer containing multitudes. Pessoa went further, claiming biographical disunity, one biological organism containing genuinely separate persons. Virginia Woolf's exploration of consciousness, particularly in The Waves, with its 6 distinct voices, resembles Pessoa's approach. But Woolf's characters remain characters, fictional persons invented by an author. Pessoa's heteronyms claim ontological status beyond fictional characters. They are, Pessoa insisted, not characters he created, but selves he became. This distinction matters philosophically. If heteronyms are characters, Pessoa's achievement is impressive literary technique. If they're genuine alternate selves, his achievement is philosophical revolution. The technical innovations Pessoa introduced to poetry remain underappreciated. Consider his use of what scholars call intersectionism, the attempt to capture multiple simultaneous perspectives in single poetic moment. Traditional poetry presents one viewpoint at a time. Intersectionist poetry tries to convey overlapping perceptions, the way consciousness actually experiences reality in layers rather than linear sequence. This anticipates later developments in experimental fiction and poetry, but was radical when Pessoa practiced it in the 1910s. His manipulation of poetic voice across the heteronyms demonstrates unprecedented sophistication. Each heteronym has distinct syntax, vocabulary, rhythm, and rhetorical patterns. Cairo writes in simple present tense with minimal subordinate clauses, reflecting his philosophy of direct perception. Race uses elaborate periodic sentences in classical meters, reflecting Stoic formality and distance. Campos shifts between manic acceleration and depressive stasis, syntax fragmenting or compressing depending on emotional state. Pessoa himself writes in complex cerebral Portuguese exploring self-consciousness and doubt. These aren't variations on a personal style. They're fundamentally different linguistic personalities. His poems also experiment with what could be called philosophical lyricism, combining intellectual content traditionally reserved for prose with lyric forms' emotional immediacy. Most poetry either expresses feeling or articulates ideas, rarely both simultaneously. Pessoa's best work achieves both, making philosophical arguments through images and metaphors that carry emotional force. The Tagus is more beautiful than the river running through my village. But the Tagus is not more beautiful than the river running through my village, because the Tagus is not the river running through my village. is simultaneously philosophical claim about incommensurability and lyric celebration of particular place. His prose, particularly the Book of Disquiet, pioneered forms that later writers adopted. The fragmentary philosophical diary, written by a fictional narrator, influenced writers from Clarice Lispector to W.G. Sebald. The blurring of autobiography and fiction, the refusal of narrative structure, the obsessive circling around existential themes, the combination of mundane observation with metaphysical speculation all became techniques other writers explored. Pessoa did this first and most extremely. The literary innovation extends to Pessoa's conception of authorship itself. Before Pessoa, pseudonyms were transparent fictions. Everyone knew George Eliot was Mary Ann Evans, George Sand was Amantine Dupin. The pseudonym protected privacy or enabled female authors to publish, but nobody confused the pseudonymous identity with actual identity. Pessoa's heteronyms are different. They claim reality independent of their creator. They have biographies, personalities, and worldviews that conflict with Pessoa's. They critique each other. They occupy different positions in Portuguese literary history. This makes authorship itself multiple and contested. This has profound implications for literary theory. Traditional theory assumes one author per text, one intention to interpret, one historical context to understand. Pessoa makes this impossible. When reading Cairo, do you interpret based on Cairo's supposed biography and beliefs, or based on Pessoa's actual circumstances, or based on the relationship between them? There is no correct answer, because the text exists in ontological ambiguity between fiction and reality, character and author, invention and discovery. Post-structuralist theorists like Roland Barthes famously declared the death of the author, arguing that texts have no stable authorial meaning, that readers create meaning through reading. Pessoa anticipated this, but from opposite direction. Barthes killed the author theoretically to liberate the text. Pessoa multiplied the author practically to demonstrate there was never a unified author to kill. Both reach similar conclusions, but through different paths. Pessoa's is more radical because he performed what Barthes only described. But Pessoa's literary innovations also reveal modernism's limitations. The heteronymic method, taken to its extreme, makes publishing impossible. If you're genuinely multiple, which self decides to publish? Which self signs contracts? Which self accepts criticism or praise? Pessoa published almost nothing because publication requires unified identity. The modernist innovation that should have produced vast literary output instead produced silence and fragments. The method undermined its own implementation. Similarly, the fragmentation of narrative and consciousness pursued to Pessoa's extreme makes communication nearly impossible. Readers struggle with the Book of Disquiet because it offers no narrative thread to follow, no character development to track, no thematic progression to anticipate. It demands unprecedented attention and patience. Most readers abandon it. The literary innovation succeeds artistically but fails practically. It produces works few people can actually read. The elevation of inwardness over external reality, taken to Pessoa's extreme, eliminates potential subject matter. If external events don't matter, if action is less real than thought, if living is less significant than imagining, what remains to write about? Only consciousness examining itself. This produces profound philosophical poetry, but limited range. Pessoa has no love poems because he had no love. No political poems because he avoided politics. No nature poems in traditional sense because nature mattered only as occasion for thought. The literary innovation impoverished literature's traditional content. Scholars debate whether Pessoa represents modernism's culmination or its reductio ad absurdum. Those who admire him see modernism's principles taken to logical conclusion, revealing truths other modernists approached but couldn't fully articulate. Those sceptical see modernism's pathologies exposed, its tendencies towards solipsism, obscurity and irrelevance realized completely. Both interpretations have merit. Pessoa showed what happens when modernist innovation proceeds without restraint. The result is simultaneously brilliant and sterile, profound and pointless. The question for contemporary literature is what to do with Pessoa's innovations. You cannot imitate the heteronyms because their point was absolute uniqueness. You cannot adopt his method wholesale because it produces isolation and incompletion. But perhaps you can learn from the principles without accepting the extremes. Recognize identity's multiplicity without fragmenting completely. Embrace inwardness without abandoning external reality. Experiment with form without making text unreadable. This moderate position might preserve Pessoa's insights while avoiding his failures. But it also might miss what makes his work significant, that it refused moderation and pursued truth wherever it led, even into silence and dissolution. Part 8. Influence, Legacy and Contemporary Relevance. Pessoa's influence presents a paradox. He published virtually nothing during his lifetime, lived in obscurity, and died unknown beyond a small circle in Lisbon. Yet he has become one of the 20th century's most influential writers, claimed as precursor by movements ranging from existentialism to postmodernism to theories of plural identity. Understanding this delayed recognition requires examining how his work entered international consciousness and why it resonates with contemporary concerns. The first crucial factor was the trunk. After Pessoa's death in 1935, his friend discovered a large wooden trunk containing over 25,000 manuscript pages, poems, prose fragments, plays, philosophical essays, translations, and miscellaneous writings. This archive took decades to organize, inventory, and publish. The first substantial edition of his poetry appeared in 1942. The first complete Portuguese edition of the Book of Disquiet appeared in 1982. Major works continued appearing through the 1990s and 2000s. Pessoa's literary career essentially began after his death. This posthumous emergence has significant implications. Unlike writers who shape their legacy through publication decisions during their lives, Pessoa left everything in chaotic manuscript form. Editors had to make fundamental choices about what to publish, how to organize fragments, which versions of poems to prefer, how to attribute works among heteronyms. Different editors made different choices, producing multiple incompatible versions of Pessoa's corpus. There is no definitive Pessoa, only editorial constructions based on manuscript evidence. This makes him modernism's most genuinely unstable author, his texts literally unfixed. International recognition came slowly. The first English translation appeared in 1938, 3 years after his death, but attracted little attention. Serious English translations began in the 1960s and 70s. The first complete English Book of Disquiet appeared in 2002. French, German, Spanish and Italian translations followed similar patterns, delayed recognition building gradually. Portuguese critics recognized his importance earlier, but Pessoa remained primarily national figure until late 20th century. The breakthrough came as literary theory and philosophy shifted in ways that made Pessoa seem prophetic. Post-structuralism's critique of unified subjectivity, its emphasis on language constructing identity rather than expressing it, its celebration of textual plurality, all found perfect embodiment in Pessoa. Theorists could point to the heteronyms as literary demonstration of what they argued philosophically. Barthes' death of the author became visible in Pessoa's proliferation of authors. Derrida's difference appeared in the endless deferral of stable meaning across heteronyms. Foucault's author function found concrete instance in how Pessoa functioned as multiple author functions simultaneously. Existentialism also claimed Pessoa retroactively. His exploration of authenticity and bad faith, his demonstration that identity is chosen not given, his emphasis on consciousness creating meaning in meaningless universe, all parallel existentialist themes. Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence could be Pessoa's motto. Camus's absurdist sensibility appears throughout the Book of Disquiet. Though Pessoa died before existentialism coalesced as movement, his work anticipated its central insights. Contemporary identity politics finds Pessoa relevant in unexpected ways. His demonstration that identity is performed, multiple, and constructed has been appropriated by queer theorists, transgender activists, and scholars studying multiple identity positions. The heteronyms model how a single person can authentically inhabit different subject positions without being accused of inauthenticity. They show that multiplicity doesn't mean incoherence, that you can be many things without being nothing. This has political implications. Pessoa never intended, but his work enables. Psychology and cognitive science have also engaged with Pessoa. Theories of modular mind, multiple self-states, and narrative identity construction find literary precedent in the heteronyms. Pessoa becomes case study in how consciousness actually operates when not forced into artificial unity. Some psychologists argue dissociative identity disorder is not pathology, but natural human condition, with Pessoa as exemplary case of healthy multiplicity. Others argue Pessoa's condition was pathological, but unusually productive. The debate continues. Writers continue discovering Pessoa as influence. Octavio Paz called him one of the century's greatest poets. Harold Bloom included him in the Western canon. Contemporary poets from the different traditions cite him as inspiration. His influence appears in poets exploring multiple voices, identity themes, and philosophical lyricism. Prose writers influenced by the Book of Disquiet include W. G. Sebald, Enrique Villa-Matas, Clarice Lispector, and many others. The fragmentary meditative prose style Pessoa pioneered has become recognized genre. Philosophically, Pessoa influenced discussions of personal identity, consciousness, and self-knowledge. Philosophers examining narrative theories of identity cite him as demonstrating narrative's constructive rather than descriptive function. Phenomenologists exploring multiperspectival consciousness find his work relevant. Philosophers of mind discussing unity of consciousness use Pessoa as thought experiment about how much disunity consciousness can tolerate. He has become philosophical resource, not just literary figure. In Portugal, Pessoa achieved something approaching secular sainthood. His face appeared on currency before the euro. Statues commemorate him. The Casa Fernando Pessoa Museum preserves his memory. Scholars produce critical editions and studies continuously. Every educated Portuguese person knows his work. He represents Portuguese cultural achievement globally, national treasure equivalent to Camões. This is ironic, given his criticism of Portuguese culture and political chaos during his lifetime. The nation he despaired of now claims him as its greatest cultural export. But Pessoa's influence also reveals potential misappropriations. Many readers claim Pessoa as ally for positions he would have rejected. Progressive scholars celebrate his identity multiplicity while ignoring his reactionary politics. Postmodernists embrace his textual instability while overlooking his mystical beliefs. Psychologists cite his mental health while missing his philosophical commitments. Everyone constructs the Pessoa useful for their purposes, which is perhaps appropriate given how Pessoa himself operated, but it risks losing the actual historical person beneath interpretive projections. The contemporary question is whether Pessoa's relevance represents genuine philosophical insight or historical accident. Did he discover permanent truths about identity and consciousness that remain valid? Or did he express peculiar early 20th century concerns that happen to resonate again late in the century? Is the current Pessoa Renaissance revealing his lasting importance or creating it through interpretation? The case for lasting importance emphasizes how Pessoa addressed questions that remain unresolved. How does consciousness create unity from multiplicity? How does identity persist through change? How do language and thought relate? How do fiction and reality interpenetrate? These are not historical questions, but permanent philosophical problems. Pessoa offered distinctive answers that illuminate even if they don't finally resolve the issues. His work rewards continued engagement because it captures something permanently true about human experience. The skeptical case emphasizes how Pessoa's reception changed with theoretical fashions. He was irrelevant when new criticism dominated, emphasizing textual unity and organic form. He became relevant when post-structuralism emphasized fragmentation and instability. He fits postmodern sensibilities but might seem dated when cultural mood shifts again. His influence depends less on inherent value than on alignment with contemporary theoretical commitments. Different eras construct different Pessoas based on their concerns. The truth is probably mixed. Some of Pessoa's insights have permanent value. The demonstration that identity is less unified than common sense assumes remains important. The exploration of how consciousness fragments while maintaining functionality illuminates cognitive architecture. The artistic achievement of creating genuinely different literary voices from single biological source shows human capacity for self-transformation. These contributions endure regardless of theoretical fashion. But other aspects date badly. His mysticism seems quaint to contemporary readers. His politics embarrass admirers. His isolation and incompletion appear pathological rather than philosophical. His refusal to publish seems less heroic refusal of commodification than inability to complete work. His vast fragments read as failure to organize thought rather than innovative form. Contemporary readers might learn from Pessoa, but shouldn't imitate him. His was a unique, unrepeatable case, valuable as demonstration of extreme possibility, but not model for practice. Perhaps Pessoa's greatest legacy is showing that literature can be philosophy, and philosophy can be literature. He collapsed the distinction between genres, making his life and work continuous experiment in consciousness. He demonstrated that the most profound philosophical insights might come through poetry rather than treatises, through fictional personas rather than systematic arguments, through literary performance rather than logical demonstration. This opens possibilities for how philosophy can be done, how questions can be explored, how truth can be articulated. Whether that opening leads anywhere productive remains to be seen. But Pessoa proved it exists, and that is contribution enough. Part 9. Major critiques and scholarly debates. Pessoa scholarship presents unusual challenges because his corpus is simultaneously too large and too incomplete. The 25,000 manuscript pages contain thousands of fragments, variant versions, contradictory statements, and works abandoned midway. Scholars face permanent uncertainty about what Pessoa actually believed versus what he was trying on, what represents genuine philosophical position versus literary experimentation, what was serious versus ironic. This generates ongoing interpretive disputes that will likely never resolve. The first major debate concerns the heteronym's ontological status. One camp argues they're sophisticated literary devices, fictional characters, Pessoa created deliberately to explore different philosophical positions. This treats Pessoa as unified author, orchestrating multiple voices for aesthetic and intellectual purposes. Evidence includes the theoretical texts where Pessoa explains the heteronym's relationships, describes their biographies systematically, and plans their interactions. This suggests conscious, deliberate construction rather than spontaneous emergence. The opposing camp argues the heteronyms represent genuine psychological multiplicity, different personality states that emerged spontaneously and functioned semi-autonomously. Evidence includes Pessoa's famous description of his triumphal day, when Cairo appeared suddenly and he wrote 30 poems in rapid succession without planning. Pessoa described this as involuntary, beyond his control. He claimed not to know what heteronyms would write until they wrote it. This suggests genuine dissociation rather than controlled performance. The debate matters philosophically because it determines what Pessoa demonstrated. If heteronyms are literary devices, his achievement is impressive, but doesn't prove identity is actually multiple. If they're genuine alternate personalities, his life constitutes empirical evidence that the self is fiction, that humans are naturally multiple. Most scholars now accept a middle position. The heteronyms were partially voluntary and partially involuntary, initially emerging spontaneously but then developed deliberately. But this compromise satisfies neither extreme. A second major debate concerns whether Pessoa's philosophy is postmodern avant la lettre or remains within metaphysical tradition. Postmodernist readers emphasize his critique of unified subjectivity, his celebration of textual instability, his refusal of absolute truth claims, his proliferation of perspectives without meta-narrative adjudicating between them. This makes him forerunner of Derrida, Lyotard, and Baudrillard, anticipating postmodernism's key moves decades before they became fashionable. Critics argue this is anachronistic projection. Pessoa operated within early 20th century frameworks quite different from postmodernism. His mysticism assumed hidden esoteric truths, hardly postmodern relativism. His nationalism presupposed unified cultural identity, contradicting postmodern anti-essentialism. His concern with authenticity, however paradoxical, differs from postmodern indifference to authenticity. The apparent similarities result from selective reading that ignores incompatible elements. Pessoa is better understood through Nietzsche, symbolism, and turn-of-century decadence than through postmodern theory. Again, scholars occupy middle ground, arguing Pessoa anticipates some postmodern insights while remaining entangled in modernist assumptions. But this generates further debate about which aspects are proto-postmodern versus truly modernist, and whether those categories apply meaningfully to someone writing before they existed. A third debate concerns Pessoa's politics and their relationship to his philosophy. Left-leaning scholars emphasize contradictions in his political thought. His opposition to Salazar's regime, despite earlier support for dictatorship, his individualist anarchism contradicting his nationalism, his actual political insignificance during his lifetime. They argue his philosophy of multiple identity undermines his reactionary politics, that the two are fundamentally incompatible. Pessoa, the philosopher, was progressive. Pessoa, the political commentator, was reactionary holdover from 19th century attitudes. Conservative and nationalist scholars argue the politics flow naturally from the philosophy. The multiplication of selves requires hierarchical ordering or descends into chaos. The rejection of unified truth makes democratic deliberation impossible. The emphasis on exceptional individuals justifies aristocratic politics. The mysticism supports spiritual authority over secular rationality. Far from contradicting his philosophy, Pessoa's politics express its necessary implications. If you accept the philosophy, the politics follow. Apolitical scholars want to separate the two, treating philosophy as serious contribution and politics as personal failing. But this requires believing someone can be brilliant about consciousness and identity while being stupid about collective existence. Possible, but suspicious. Perhaps the uncomfortable truth is that Pessoa's philosophy genuinely does support reactionary politics, or at least fails to prevent them. The multiplication of perspectives without any principle for choosing between them easily becomes nihilism or will to power. A fourth debate concerns the role of mysticism and esotericism in Pessoa's thought. Rationalist scholars dismiss this as biographical curiosity, personal eccentricity irrelevant to his philosophical and literary achievement. What matters is the poetry and prose, which can be appreciated without accepting astrology or Rosicrucianism. The mysticism is detachable from the genuine insights, historical accident of Pessoa's time and place, rather than essential component. Esotericist scholars argue this is fundamental misunderstanding. The mysticism isn't addition to Pessoa's philosophy, but its foundation. The heteronyms make sense only within esoteric framework, where reality consists of multiple interpenetrating levels, where correspondences connect apparently separate phenomena, where symbolic thinking reveals truth inaccessible to reason. Remove the esotericism, and you lose what makes Pessoa distinctive, reducing him to standard modernist writer. His greatness lies precisely in combining literary innovation with occult practice, philosophy with mysticism, rational analysis with irrational intuition. Recent scholarship has tried rehabilitating the mysticism, taking it seriously as philosophical position rather than dismissing it. This generates debate about whether scholars should reconstruct Pessoa's esoteric worldview sympathetically or critique it as irrational belief system. Can you understand Pessoa without believing what he believed? Or does understanding require some degree of acceptance, entering imaginatively into worldview very different from contemporary secular rationalism? A fifth debate concerns psychological interpretation. Some scholars argue Pessoa exhibited pathological dissociation, that the heteronyms represent mental disorder rather than philosophical insight or literary technique. His isolation, inability to maintain relationships, struggles with decision-making, and productive obsession all suggest psychological dysfunction. From this perspective, celebrating Pessoa risks romanticizing mental illness, treating pathology as profundity. Other scholars reject psychiatric diagnosis of historical figures as inappropriate and reductive. Pessoa functioned well enough to work steadily, maintain friendships, and produce vast literary output. The heteronyms were controlled and deliberate, not symptomatic of disease. Unusual doesn't mean unhealthy. Pessoa explored possibilities of consciousness that most people avoid, but this is philosophical courage, not psychological problem. Pathologizing exceptional cases imposes normalcy as standard and dismisses innovation as illness. This debate cannot be resolved because we lack adequate evidence about Pessoa's inner experience, and modern diagnostic categories apply poorly to historical figures. But it raises important questions about the relationship between genius and madness, creativity and dysfunction, philosophical insight and psychological disturbance. Pessoa might have been both brilliant and disturbed, his achievement inseparable from his pathology. A sixth debate concerns intentionality and meaning. Traditional interpretation assumes authors intend meanings that readers recover, but Pessoa's multiplication of authors makes this impossible. When Cairo writes, "To think is not to understand," does this express Pessoa's view? Cairo's view? A view Pessoa was exploring? Opposition? Pessoa was articulating to critique? There's no way to know. The text exists in interpretive limbo, meaning unstable because authorial intention is unavailable or multiply available. Some scholars celebrate this as liberating readers to create meaning. Others see it as interpretive nightmare, making rigorous analysis impossible. If anything can mean anything, if no reading is wrong because there's no authorial intention to violate, criticism becomes subjective preference. The debate reflects larger disagreements in literary theory about whether meaning resides in texts, authors, readers, or interpretive communities. A seventh debate concerns Pessoa's place in philosophical canon. Is he philosopher who used literary form, or writer whose work has philosophical content? Academic philosophers largely ignore him, considering his work literature rather than philosophy. Literary scholars study him extensively but often minimize the philosophical dimensions, treating ideas as themes in poetry rather than systematic positions. This leaves Pessoa in disciplinary limbo, claimed by neither field fully. Some scholars argue for recognizing Pessoa as genuine philosopher, whose method was literary but whose concerns and insights were philosophical. Others argue literature and philosophy remain distinct, that Pessoa's refusal of systematic argumentation disqualifies him as philosopher, however profound his insights. This reflects ongoing tensions about whether philosophy must be systematic, whether literary forms can be genuinely philosophical, whether poetic truth differs from philosophical truth. An eighth debate concerns translation and interpretation. Pessoa wrote primarily in Portuguese, with substantial English work and some French. His Portuguese plays with idiom, rhythm, and linguistic subtlety that resists translation. Different translators make different choices, producing significantly different Pessoas in English. The person reading Pessoa in translation receives a fundamentally different experience from someone reading in Portuguese. This raises questions about how international reputation depends on translation quality and choices, whether non-Portuguese readers can really understand Pessoa. Related is debate about how much historical and cultural context matters. Pessoa's work is deeply embedded in early 20th century Portuguese history and culture. International readers often lack this context, reading him as if he wrote universally rather than particularly. Portuguese scholars sometimes accuse international reception of decontextualizing Pessoa, making him more postmodern and universal than he actually was, losing the specificity that makes him Portuguese. These scholarly debates will continue indefinitely because Pessoa's work resists definitive interpretation. His deliberate multiplication of perspectives, his refusal to complete works, his posthumous publication in editors' hands, his combination of incompatible elements all create permanent interpretive instability. Every reading is partial, every interpretation contestable. Perhaps this is fitting for someone whose philosophy emphasized multiplicity and rejected unity. There is no single correct understanding of Pessoa because Pessoa himself was not single. The debates are the appropriate scholarly response to a genuinely plural thinker. Part 10, where Pessoa's philosophy fails and limitations. Any honest evaluation must acknowledge where Pessoa's philosophy breaks down, where its insights become liabilities, where pushing principles to extremes produces not truth but dysfunction. His failures are as instructive as his successes, revealing not just personal limitations but philosophical dead ends that others should avoid. The first fundamental failure is practical impossibility. Pessoa's philosophy describes experience accurately in important ways but cannot be lived. The multiplication of identity, the rejection of unified self, the emphasis on consciousness over action, the privileging of imagination over reality, all sound profound but prove catastrophic when actually practiced. Pessoa himself demonstrated this tough. He published virtually nothing, maintained no intimate relationships, achieved no external success, and died alone from cirrhosis at 47. This is not coincidental failure. It's necessary consequence of his philosophy. Consider the paralysis problem. If identity is multiple and fragmentary, decision-making becomes impossible. Every choice requires believing the choosing self will persist long enough to experience consequences. But if the self that chooses differs from the self that experiences results, why should current self sacrifice for future self? Pessoa recognized this intellectually, writing about it extensively. But he never resolved it. His solution was essentially to avoid major decisions, to drift through life, to leave work incomplete. This is not philosophical wisdom. It's admission of defeat. The isolation problem follows necessarily. If consciousness is primary reality, an external world is less real than imagination. Why engage with others? Other people exist primarily in your imagination anyway. The actual person before you is less real than your idea of them. Pessoa lived this logic to its conclusion, spending most of time alone, avoiding deep relationships, treating people as objects of observation rather than partners in life. The Book of Disquiet's narrator works in an office but barely notices colleagues. The few people mentioned are described externally, never as subjects with their own inner lives. This is solipsism, philosophical position that only your mind certainly exists. Taken seriously, solipsism makes ethics impossible because other minds become theoretical entities rather than real beings with moral claims on you. The completion problem reveals another failure. If imagined achievement is more real than actual achievement, all motivation for finishing work disappears. Why complete the poem when the imagined poem is superior? Why publish when publication exposes work to criticism and corruption? Pessoa left thousands of fragments because his philosophy made completion less valuable than potential. But this means his philosophy is anti-productive. It undermines conditions necessary for its own articulation. A philosophy that cannot be articulated coherently or completely is self-undermining. The communication problem is even deeper. Language requires shared meaning, stable concepts, and mutual understanding. But if identity is multiple, consciousness fragmented, and meaning constructed rather than discovered, communication becomes accident rather than achievement. You can string words together, but cannot ensure the reader constructs meanings you intended. Pessoa's texts exemplify this problem. They're brilliantly written but fundamentally ambiguous, meaning whatever readers construct from them. This is celebrated as richness, but is actually poverty. If communication is impossible, philosophy becomes private language game, meaningless to others. The responsibility problem has moral implications. Legal and ethical systems require that persons are accountable for their actions. The person who commits crime must be the same person punished later. But if identity is discontinuous, changing fundamentally moment to moment, responsibility becomes incoherent. The person who acted is different from the person who faces consequences. This isn't just a theoretical problem. Pessoa avoided commitments, broke promises, and failed obligations because he genuinely felt the future self who would bear consequences was a different person. A philosophy that eliminates responsibility eliminates ethics. The value problem undermines all judgment. If reality is constructed, truth relative to perspective, and meaning subjective, what basis exists for evaluating anything? Pessoa's philosophy provides no criteria for distinguishing good from bad, true from false, beautiful from ugly. All perspectives are equally valid because validity itself is perspectival. This is radical relativism, position that collapses under its own weight. Even claiming all perspectives are valid is itself a perspective requiring justification. But justification requires standards beyond perspective, which relativism denies. The position is self-refuting. The verification problem makes mysticism and esotericism philosophically useless. If claims cannot be rationally verified or empirically tested, they're indistinguishable from delusion. Pessoa's astrological predictions were mostly wrong. His prophecies about Portugal's Fifth Empire proved false. His magical practices produced no effects. Yet he continued believing because esoteric knowledge supposedly transcends rational verification. But this makes everything permissible. You can believe anything if you reject verification. This isn't wisdom, it's wishful thinking, defended with sophistry. The political failure is moral catastrophe. Pessoa's philosophy leads naturally to authoritarianism or nihilism. If there's no truth, might makes right. If identity is fluid, no one is responsible. If masses are spiritually inferior to initiates, democracy is mistake. If national destiny is mystically determined, evidence is irrelevant. Pessoa's actual politics express these implications. Support for dictatorship, contempt for democracy, belief in spiritual aristocracy, racist nationalism. These aren't aberrations. They follow from his philosophical premises. The mental health failure is perhaps most troubling. Pessoa's philosophy sounds like rationalization for dissociative disorder. The inability to integrate experience into unified self, the fragmenting of identity into separate personalities, the withdrawal from reality into fantasy, the paralysis and isolation all characterize pathological dissociation. Modern psychology treats this as disorder requiring treatment, not philosophical achievement to celebrate. Pessoa might have been brilliant despite his disorder, but we shouldn't confuse brilliance with health or wisdom. The academic failure is also significant, but despite Pessoa's philosophical aspirations, academic philosophy largely ignores him. He appears in no standard philosophy curricula, no histories of philosophy, no reference works defining the canon. Philosophers don't take him seriously as philosopher because he didn't do philosophy properly. No systematic arguments, no logical rigour, no engagement with technical literature, no clear positions to evaluate. He studied in literature departments, not philosophy departments. This is telling. Whatever Pessoa achieved, it wasn't philosophy by professional standards. The predictive failure matters too. Pessoa made specific claims about future developments. Portugal would lead spiritual transformation of humanity. The Fifth Empire would manifest. Portuguese language would dominate. Astrological configurations would determine historical outcomes. None of this happened. Portugal declined further after his death, losing its colonies and becoming economically marginal. Portuguese language didn't spread. No spiritual empire emerged. The predictions failed completely. Yet Pessoa staked his philosophy on their truth. The failure of predictions suggests the philosophy generating them was false. The empirical failure emerges from cognitive science. Modern research on consciousness, identity and memory contradicts Pessoa's picture. There is neural continuity maintaining identity over time. Memory integration creates biographical unity. Multiple personality disorder is pathological precisely because normal integration fails. The brain implements unified self through distributed processes coordinating different modules. Pessoa's philosophy describes anomalous experience, not normal cognition. Generalizing from his case, to universal claims about identity is fallacy of composition. The interpretive failure appears in scholarship's inability to reach consensus. If Pessoa's philosophy were clear and true, scholars would converge on standard interpretation. Instead, they disagree fundamentally about what he believed, whether he was serious, how to read his texts, which elements are central versus peripheral. This isn't productive disagreement advancing understanding. It's interpretive chaos suggesting the text lacked determinate meaning. Philosophy requires clarity sufficient for others to understand and evaluate. Pessoa's deliberate obscurity and multiplication of perspectives prevents this. The existential failure is most damning. Pessoa's life was miserable. He achieved little recognition during his lifetime, formed no lasting relationships, produced no completed major works, died alone and unknown. His last words were reportedly, "I don't know what tomorrow will bring." This is not someone who found truth and lived accordingly. This is someone whose philosophy made life unlivable. The proof of philosophy is whether it enables good life. Pessoa's philosophy enabled productive suffering at best, but not flourishing. Ancient philosophers agreed that good philosophy makes you happy, wise and virtuous. Pessoa's philosophy made him isolated, paralyzed and alcoholic. Yet acknowledging these failures doesn't entirely negate Pessoa's value. Sometimes failure is instructive. Pessoa explored philosophical possibilities to their limits and discovered they don't work. This is useful knowledge. We learn what not to do. His life demonstrates that complete skepticism about identity, total withdrawal into imagination, absolute multiplication of perspectives, and radical rejection of unity lead nowhere livable. The insights are valuable, the extremes are cautionary tales. The question is whether you can extract the insights while avoiding the failures. Can you acknowledge identity's constructed nature without fragmenting into paralysis? Recognize consciousness's multiplicity without denying unity entirely? Value imagination while engaging with reality? Appreciate multiple perspectives while making commitments? Perhaps Pessoa's failures reveal not that his insights are false, but that they're dangerous truths requiring careful handling. Some truths are psychologically toxic, spiritually corrosive, practically catastrophic, even while being descriptively accurate. Perhaps the self is fiction, but we need that fiction to function. Perhaps identity is multiple, but we must perform unity to live. Perhaps consciousness is fragmentary, but we must maintain coherence to act. This suggests tragic reading of Pessoa. He discovered truths that destroyed him. He was right about what he saw, but wrong to look so directly. Like staring at the sun, complete self-awareness blinds and burns. The deepest irony is that Pessoa's philosophy proves itself false through his own life. If the philosophy were correct, it would enable good life, but it enabled catastrophic failure. This suggests the philosophy captures partial truths while missing something essential. That missing element might be precisely what makes life livable. The useful fictions of unified self, stable identity, external reality, possibility of action, meaningfulness of choice. Pessoa destroyed these fictions intellectually while discovering you cannot live without them practically. His legacy is not a philosophy to adopt, but a limit to recognize. Go this far and no further. See this much, but not more. Question identity, but maintain continuity. Embrace multiplicity, but preserve unity. Value imagination, but engage with reality. Pessoa marks the boundary between insight and insanity, between philosophical courage and pathological dissolution. His achievement is showing where that boundary lies by crossing it completely. We should learn from his journey without repeating it. The value is in the warning, not the example.